Good for James to get into the hospital there when he did. It was kind of a scary time, I guess, and his foot wasn't looking too good, but thank you for your prayers. I'm sure he appreciates them. James, if you're watching this later this afternoon or sometime this week, we miss you, buddy. Hope to have you back here next week. And hi to Erica up in Summerside. I know you've been missing things last month. We're good to be back. I feel like that lady on Romper Room. Remember at the end when she looked into the mirror and talked all this? She never once said my name. In all the years I watched it, which is probably like 3 months, but it's one of those things that you remember, isn't it? Our dogs that we have at home, Crypto and Chewy, they are two of the most spoiled dogs you could ever imagine. They get way too much attention from us. Chewy, he will play, he has so much energy until he finally passes out. If we will throw his ball for him, he is there. Let's go, let's go, let's go. And Crypto, let's just say he eats way too many treats, okay? He likes to cuddle up next to Francine at night. And, she will not, accommodate for herself. However he wants to sit and cozy up, even if her back is hurting, she will adjust so that Crypto will be comfortable and warm. He's so spoiled. And no matter what the weather's like outside, those two guys, they will get out for their walk every day, and they really look forward to it. No one will ever criticize us as owners for not caring about our canine companions. My folks, they did the same thing with their pups. Mom's dog, Joy, she was, as the vet put it, overnourished. Dad took Muffin out for a walk every single day in the blazing sun or the frigid winter. And Alf had the run of the house. And before Alf, there was Spooky. Spooky was our dog when I was just a little kid. He liked to go outside a lot. Way back in those days, when you were allowed to let your dogs out, you just kind of go out all willy-nilly. Remember those days before, kids had to wear bike helmets and seat belts in cars were optional? And dogs, they were allowed to be outside by themselves, not on a leash like they have to be today. So Spooky would be let out. He would wander around the neighborhood for a couple hours to go and visit his friends and do his business and really who knows what else. Spooky was probably a father and we didn't even know it, different times back then. Back when a litter of puppies was born and people gave them away for free. You remember that? Now they make up some weird name to make it sound fancy and charge a couple of grand for the thing, But back then, that the time where dogs were allowed to do that, it was drawing to a close, and dogs were supposed to be kept on leashes, but Mom didn't really adapt all that quickly to that rule. And so she still let Spooky out regularly by himself. One day, though, the dog catcher was in our neighborhood. And spotting our dog wandering around, he very smartly went up to Spooky, and he was very friendly to him, probably gave him a treat, and said, "Hey boy, why don't you go on home?" And so our brilliant dog did as he was told and strutted home to introduce us to his new friend. Mom looked out to see him proudly walking up the driveway with the strange man following him a few feet back. Spooky hopped in the house, and the man smiled and handed her a ticket. "Good job," she said to Spooky. "You showed the dog catcher where you lived." Did you know that Jesus knew where his followers lived? It's true. He knew what was occurring in their lives. He knew the epic battle going on between good and evil ongoing around them. He knew that they were fighting for what was right and true against the lies of the enemy who was always trying to deceive his people. We've been going through, way back when, the 7 letters from Jesus written by the Apostle John, recorded for us in the book of Revelation. These 7 churches, they were unique on their own with their individual issues and personalities. But the advice and the teachings offered by Jesus, they're also applicable to every church, all of his followers, for all time and for every culture. Today we're going to land in the city of Pergamum. Great name. It was actually the ancient capital of Asia, and it was built on this 1,000-foot high sector of land. Its name in Greek meant Citadel because of that. It was named that because of its location, kind of where it was situated, but also because it was the official center of emperor worship at the time in the area. Now, when I mean emperor, I don't mean that wrinkly guy in the black robe from Star Wars. I mean the Roman emperor. And Jesus' words make sense to us when we understand this fact and what was going on. We pick up in Revelation chapter 2, verse 13, where Jesus says, I know that you live in the city where Satan has his throne. Yet you have remained loyal to me. You refuse to deny me, even when Antipas, my faithful witness, was martyred among you there in Satan's city. Like the local dog catcher in our area, Jesus knew where these people were living. And it was not a pleasant place to be if you were a Christian. Because the devil lived there. Satan's city, Jesus called it. That's, a marketing idea for tourism growth. I don't think so, calling it that. But he said it's where Satan has his throne. Now, we can't take this literally and picture a guy with horns and a pitchfork and probably wearing a Boston Bruins jersey, sitting on this big fiery throne in the middle of this city, okay? His mailing address was not Pergamum, Asia Minor, all right? No, this reference is likely to what I mentioned before, but this place being this hotspot of activity regarding the worship of the Roman emperor, all right? His name was Domitian at this time, and he thought of himself as a god, all right? Not just, a stud muffin like myself, but as a literal deity, okay? John had been banished to the island of Patmos as punishment for saying that Jesus was the only God and denying that Domitian was one too. Domitian's ego was a little bit large, to say the least. There was actually a statue. Well, there was more than one statue. There was many of him, but there was one in particular that when you came into port on a ship, it was built so huge you could see it clearly coming into port for miles. Like the Statue of Liberty in New York. It was that big. So when this city became the hub and the center of activity regarding the literal worship of this man, well, you can begin to see why there may be a few problems for Christians who were living there. Remember back then when it came to the worship of false gods, that usually involved some form of sexual activity as part of the whole process. It always seemed to go hand in hand with that stuff. And amazingly, it still does. We may not worship emperors like they did, but sex is certainly a god in our culture, isn't it? You show me a commercial or a music video that doesn't use it to draw us in, I'll be surprised. And with all this activity happening, it would have been difficult for the church existing there to simply blend in. Because as Jesus followers, they would have felt compelled to speak and to teach about Jesus, right? That's kind of the point, isn't it? The last words Jesus spoke to his followers before he left was to, as you go about in the world, you go and you make disciples and teach them to obey everything that he had taught them, to share his love, to prove that his story, his gospel was real, that it's the truth, it's the hope that will bring light to the world, that will show us how to live life, live to the fullest. The church is the hands, it's the feet of Jesus. The church is the hope of the world. Therefore, the church cannot sit idly by and just meet quietly and try to stay under the radar. camouflaged, making no impact. No one lights a lamp and then sticks it under a bowl. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. No, we are meant to be seen and heard in order to make a difference for good in our world. And here, the church was shining their light. They remained true to the name of Jesus. They would not renounce their faith in him. Even with what happened to Antipas here. Tradition tells us that because he would not stop talking about Jesus, Emperor Domitian had him dragged in front of a crowd. He took out his bronze kettle that he took out and used on special occasions. And he had Antipas slowly roasted to death in it, boiled alive. And they watched their brother in Christ be murdered, his life stolen, ripped from him in excruciating pain. His screams likely echoed in their minds for years to come. But even with that, they would not go against their Savior. And they still proclaimed the gospel to anyone who would listen. That's an amazing testimony. Yet, like any church, there were still issues they had to work on. Jesus continues. But I have a few complaints against you. You tolerate some among you whose teaching is like that of Balaam, who showed Balak how to trip up the people of Israel. He taught them to sin by eating food offered to idols and by committing sexual sin. Balaam is one of those characters back in the Old Testament that many recall from his experience with his talking donkey. You remember that story way back when? I am encouraged by this donkey, because I figure if God can speak his truth into that thing, I guess he can use me. But as the story goes, Balaam was a guy who would get hired by other people to do jobs, shall we say. He wasn't a bounty hunter like Boba Fett. He wasn't hired muscle to go and to bust up someone's kneecaps if their debts weren't paid. No, his manner of employment was a bit more unique. He was a diviner, a soothsayer, as the King James Version would say, or in a more modern definition in terms, a sorcerer, kind of an Old Testament Harry Potter. He was not a prophet sent by God, but someone who used his connections to the dark forces in this world in order to be able to predict some events and to bring curses down on people, even nations at times. In this instance, the nation of Israel was at war again with the nation of Moab. Kind of seems sometimes like Israel was at war, every second time we glance at their history. Some people are bothered by all of the war, the seemingly senseless violence back in the Old Testament, but it was just the way things were done back then. People were still people, the same they are now. Nations fought. And even though we think, we're so much more enlightened today, watch the news, okay? Nations still fight because the last time I checked, the leaders in charge want to be the kings of the castle. That's kind of a game that we used to play back in school, and a lot of people never seem to be able to stop playing it even after they grow up. Except now, they have guns, and they have missiles and nuclear weapons. But the king of Moab at the time, his name was Balak. And he heard that Balaam could put on a magic show, like he could bring down a curse on nations and such. And so he hired him to go and to give a whammy to Israel, his enemy. But of course, on his way to do so, God shows up. He works his power through an angel being sent to dissuade him from doing this, and by allowing his donkey to try and talk some sense into his master. You know, other than the serpent speaking in Genesis chapter 3, this is the only time in the Bible that an animal talks. Little trivia for those of you who like to watch Jeopardy and stuff like that. Help you out. If my dog spoke, I'm pretty sure it would be, let's play and feed me. That's it. But after this event, we discover that Balaam, even after seeing the power of God at work, he's still drawn to evil, like so many people are. And he convinces the Israelites, especially the men, to compromise on what God has told them. There's this group of Moabite women who come and seduce the Israelite men to come and take part in some of their worship practices, all right? Part of these acts involve eating, which apparently has always been and still is the way to a man's heart. And, even back then it still was. Now, for ages, of course, these men, they've been surviving on manna supplied by God. So the look of real food, the sights, the smells of something other than that plain dry bread, that probably would have been tempting. But of course, that food was used in sacrifices to these false gods like Baal, something that was detestable to God, forbidden by God. But then alongside the delicious-looking food was also the dessert that was waiting for them afterwards. Because, of course, with these worship rituals always came these acts of sexual immorality. And these men were led to these free pleasures, an all-you-can-eat buffet of food, and a bunch of women willing to do anything with them as well. Needless to say, their desire to follow God was overcome by their own desires. Nothing good came from their actions. Their compromise brought about a plague, and many of them died as a result. Now, fast forward in time to the Christians living in Pergamum, who would have been very familiar with this Old Testament story. They were commended by Jesus for not renouncing their faith, but then also corrected because they too, like their ancestors, were willing to compromise. My mom got nosebleeds if the air was too dry, so in the wintertime, they put this humidifier upstairs in the hallway to keep the moisture levels going. The machine was this old, ugly, brown contraption that probably used more electricity than a dryer does today. But Dad did his best to keep Mom content. Happy wife, happy life was as true back then as it is today. But that thing was so heavy and bulky. And every night we could tell when Dad came to bed because he would walk upstairs and, obviously trying to save money from the expensive humidifier, he would leave the light off and he would always whack his foot against the side of that beast in the hallway. Like clockwork, you could hear the creak of the stairs of him coming up, followed by this loud metallic bang, and then a subtle, oh, Dad's going to bed. The word used here to describe what the Jesus followers were doing is that they were being tripped up. All right? Elsewhere, it is the same word. It's translated in other various translations of the Bible. Maybe you've heard the phrase stumbling block before. And this word brings with it the idea of a hunting trap that's used to catch the food of some prey and to snare it or cause it to trip up so that it can be caught. The Greek word is scandalon. It's where we get our English word scandal from. A little bit of trivia for you Jeopardy fans there. But we use that word scandal often. We describe it, whenever a person, often a leader or a politician of some type, they get their hand caught in the cookie jar, or get their, caught with their pants down, so to speak, something like that. Some scandalous thing that happens to them, and we see them exposed. But you know what's so interesting about these stories that we hear more and more often today? They're not really news anymore, are they? We're not surprised. We've kind of come to kind of expect them. The States had a president years ago who was impeached for fooling around with an intern in the Oval Office. Everyone knew what the truth was, but then they re-elected him. Then another guy got in more recently who is the walking definition of the word scandal. But in those cases, we don't really care anymore, do we? We almost don't even want to hear about them. They're so blah. They don't bother us like maybe they used to. And why is that? Why do these actions we hear about, why do they not register in our brains differently than they used to? I mean, most TV shows we watch today, everybody is sleeping with everybody else. Language, it's not even a consideration anymore. Man, you watch some shows on Netflix and stuff, it's like, wow, there's no censoring whatsoever. Violence is so ramped up. There is so much more blood and explosions. The better, the more the merrier, right? You go back in time, even 50, 60 years ago. Married couples on TV, even if the camera showed their bedroom, they had separate twin beds. That's hilarious. I always as a kid, Fred and Wilma had separate beds. Where did Pebbles come from? She just appeared, right? There's an episode of the original Star Trek back in the 60s. Captain Kirk, he fell in love again, but this time she had to die, and he had to let her die. And he was hurting, he was bothered by it. And when he told the Enterprise he was ready to beam up, he said, "Let's get the hell out of here." Whoa! 1967. The networks at the time, you read about it, they nearly had a cow. They almost did not air the episode. It was so scandalous. I see it today and hardly notice. Do you know what concerned viewers voted to be the most violent TV show that aired about 50 years ago? Looney Tunes. Bugs Bunny, because poor Wile E. Coyote kept getting blown up and falling off cliffs. Poof! Remember that? We laugh at that today. We think it's silly. It's ridiculous. But there is something to be said about the concern that people had for morals and their sensitivity to what might have been seen as scandalous. These stumbling blocks, the traps, the snares, they're very real. And God knows what will hurt us, and that is why He warns us to watch out for them. To keep our eyes, our ears on alert, to always be ready. Because eventually, we'll get hurt by it. So will the people around us in our lives. But when we live in a culture like we do, like our brothers and sisters in Pergamum did, the temptation is there to be like that proverbial frog in the kettle. As the heat slowly rises around us, and the water that we're sitting in around us, it starts to boil, but we just adapt. We get comfortable and we accept the way things are. We tolerate them, as Jesus says here. Because for a time, it's nice. Sitting in a jacuzzi, right? But the thing, the warning that Jesus gives here, The thing about sitting in boiling water is, eventually, you cook. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the reminder, for the warning that Jesus gives to his followers in Pergamum, to his followers here today. Because it is so easy, God, in this world where we are surrounded by things, where the temptations around us are so prevalent. And Father, it is so much easier to just stay quiet, to blend in, to camouflage, and to be like everybody else, and to become just accepting of what's normal, what's considered to be normal in our world and our culture. Father, I just pray you would help us as your children to remain vigilant, to not give up on our faith, and to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this world. A city on the hill can't be hidden. And we don't light a lamp, only to just cover it up. Father, help us to shine the light that is within our hearts out into this world. Not being finger pointers, not being judges, not being harsh and just trying to criticize and point out the world's flaws, Father. But just doing good, loving people no matter what, and just being willing to speak the truth whenever that time arises and the chances that we have are made. Thank you for Jesus being an example to this, Father, and always being willing to speak the truth in love every chance you have. In his name we pray. Amen.